This is When You Were Everything, chapter Nobody, pages 247 to 253. It's a then. We're flashing back to December, second week. Nobody. It had been 3 days since I yelled at Layla in the hallway, 13 since she'd texted or called. It was also the day that Daddy was moving out. Whoever had occupied the apartment he'd found had decided to move early, so they could be settled in their new place before the holidays. My parents thought that this was a good idea, for Daddy to be settled before the new year and his new job started, so we wouldn't even be having a final Christmas together as a family that lived in the same place. I could barely look at my mother, because it felt like everything that was happening with Daddy was all her fault, and I was upset with myself because Layla's complete and utter silence was mostly mine. Daddy had already started lining up boxes of his clothes, books, records, and art along the hallway when I woke up. "You'll have 2 Christmases," he said, when he found me in the hall, weeping with his copy of Anthony and Cleopatra in my hands. "God, Daddy, I'm not a 5-year-old, I said, throwing the book back into the box I'd lifted it out of. "You should know I don't care about that." Daddy looked wounded, and I felt bad for making something that was clearly hard for him harder. I was just about to apologize when my mom stepped out of the bathroom and said, "Cleo, I know you're upset, but we don't use that kind of language in this house." I didn't apologize then. I just started crying harder. "Seriously, Mom? You're lecturing me about the language when Daddy's stuff is in the boxes all along our hallway? Are you even human?" I slammed my bedroom door, dressed quickly, and ran out of the apartment after that, not looking back at either of them. I didn't want to see the agony on my mother's face or have to deal with my father's sadness. And I knew I couldn't be there when the movers arrived and he and everything he owned disappeared from our home for good. At school, I discovered that the chorus girls had rallied around Layla, and because of what I'd said to her in front of them, I was instantly their enemy. Seeing them step into the school building unexpectedly and almost immediately made my bad morning worse. "Look who it is," I heard a high-pitched voice trill as soon as I closed my locker. A few people snickered, and I didn't need to turn around to know who was speaking. Sage whispered as she passed me, still not knowing what my name actually was, and clearly not caring. "It looks like someone threw up on her face," Melody said next. She spoke quietly, just loudly enough for me to hear. I hadn't heard that one in a while, but my face full of freckles had prepared me for those kinds of insults. I'd been hearing them all my life. Maybe starting a day cursing in front of my parents had made me brave, given me courage, had made me stupidly brave. Because without looking at them, I said, "Funny, that the best you got?" "It looks like she just came from a bad funeral," Cadence muttered next, like I hadn't spoke a word. "Do your parents always wear black too, because they're mourning your birth?" At the mention of my parents, I lost most, if not all, of my nerve. I thought of the boxes back home, and my heart began breaking all over again. I started walking a little more quickly down the hall. "And her hair," Sage said, and I knew what came next would sting, especially because Sage was black too. She knew what it was like to live with black hair, with feeling like it was never straight enough or long enough or good enough. So she knew exactly what to say to cut right to the heart of me, quick and deep. "It's so nappy and gross looking. Say it with me, Chloe. Shampoo, condition, rinse, and repeat. And have you ever heard of a flat iron?" They laughed, and I wanted to pull their hair out at the roots. I clenched my fists so tightly that I could feel my nails digging into my palms. I looked up then, because I knew that Layla had to be with them. My chest felt heavy, and I couldn't get enough air into my lungs when my eyes met hers. She wasn't smiling, and she wasn't adding to the flurry of insults that they were hurling in my direction. But she wasn't doing anything to stop them, either. Come on, guys, Sloane said, and I thought, is it really going to be her that puts an end to this? I made the mistake of looking hopeful, of glancing over at her instead of keeping my eyes on Layla or looking back down. Sloane stared right at me, through me, and said, anyone who says the stuff she said to their best friend isn't worth our time. She turned to Layla. She's literal trash, and you don't need her. And then to me, a nobody. I was hot with fury, cold and achy with hurt, and I didn't know a body could contain such a storm of feeling until they kept talking, kept laughing. Sloane threw her arm over Layla's shoulder, and Layla looked down at her shoes, her curtain of 2 straight hair falling over her face. And still she stayed quiet. Her silence was the worst part of it. When they passed, I waited, and eventually the icy flames inside me passed too. And though I was hurting like those girls had punched me and kicked me and left me for dead, I was somehow still standing. If anyone saw me, there'd be no evidence that anything had ever happened. That's the thing about words. They can leave you both unscathed and completely gutted. Girls wage endless wars with their voices, tearing you apart without touching you. I spent all of homeroom trying hard not to listen to every word Sloane was saying to Layla a few feet behind me, but I heard most of it anyway, and plenty of it was awful things about me. About halfway through the period, I couldn't take it anymore, so when my phone buzzed with an email notification that my application status for the Shakespeare program had changed, I was so relieved I lost my breath. I raised my hand and asked for a hall pass, and when Mr. Yoon granted me my freedom, I raced to Novak's classroom, desperate for some good news. I couldn't help but imagine the open-air performances I'd attend in London, the people I would meet, and what their accents would sound like. I daydreamed constantly about being away from this place, away from Layla and Sloane and all my family's drama. And here it finally was, my way out. Miss Novak was just as excited as I was. Well, she said, open it. And so I opened the email so we could read it together. I logged into the application website and we both held our breath. But instead of seeing words that would give me an escape from everything that was going wrong, I was only offered one more disappointment. I didn't get in, I whispered, and the words were like a tiny tornado in my subconscious, knocking things off shelves and shattering all the windows in my mind. I wasn't going to London for the summer, when it was the one thing I'd been counting on as every other part of my life spiraled out of control. I stood there in disbelief, rereading the screen, though there was nothing confusing about the words. We regret to inform you. I looked at Novak, feeling like this was all her fault in some way. She was the one who had told me I was a shoo-in. She was the reason I'd known about the program at all. How is this possible? Novak asked herself, or maybe the air around us. I knew she wasn't talking to me. She lifted the phone from my hands and scrolled through the entire length of the rejection, like reading it again would change what it meant. Your application was perfect. Your statement was brilliant. I wrote you that recommendation. I just don't understand. But I hadn't understood most of what had happened to me lately. It felt like my life was turning into a bit of a joke. So I laughed a little. I actually laughed. It's okay, I said to Miss Novak. I let the blow of this settle in my gut with the rest of the hurt that was eating me alive. It's fine. Let me make a few phone calls, Novak said, but I shook my head. Don't worry about it. And just as I turned to leave, Layla burst into Novak's class grinning. Miss Novak, you're not going to believe this, but... When she saw me, she fell silent. Her smile disappeared and she crossed her arms. I wanted to know what she was about to say, but I knew she wouldn't say more while I was standing there. I ached to apologize for what I said, but after this morning, I felt she owed me much more than I owed her. I gotta get to class, I said to Novak. But when I stepped past Layla and into the hall, my feet carried me elsewhere. I went to the library. I hung out in my favorite corner for the next 2 periods, rereading King Lear, and then I skipped lunch too. The substitute librarian didn't know that people hid in the stacks, and that she'd need to do hourly rounds just to make sure no one was making out or skipping classes on her watch. So there I stayed, undiscovered for hours. At the end of the school day, I didn't even stop at my locker. I just needed to get out of the building as quickly as possible. But I bumped into the chorus girls as I was trying to make my escape, and they started up again, laughing at me and saying impossibly horrible things that shredded whatever was left of my insides. I stood there and took it. I didn't say a word, because I hoped there was a finite amount of meanness they could send in my direction before they got bored. And there was. They stopped and walked away from me after a few nauseating minutes, and I could breathe again. If only until I thought about WYWE's silence, my dad's boxes, the Shakespeare program, and, as always, like a current under everything, Gigi. The chorus girls were trying to ruin me, but they didn't realize that I had nothing left to lose.